Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm the founder and president of the National Center for Inquiry Improvement, or NCII. My colleague Chris Baldwin is part of my team with me. He is the former director of the Michigan Student Success Center, where they implemented a statewide guided pathways project over 4 years, and also worked at Jobs for the Future out of Boston, supporting the student success centers in 16 states across the country, including yours here in Wisconsin. I'll tell you a little bit about the journey that brings us to here, not out of any sense of pedigree, but to, sometimes things like guided pathways seem like they've dropped out of the sky. Right on, now we're talking about guided pathways. We were talking about MOOCs, then we were talking about competency-based education, and next up in the roulette of acronyms, we're going to talk about guided pathways, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that, but just to let you know a little bit about NCII, this is an organization I started about 6 years ago. I come from the California Community College system. Grew up in San Jose. My education is in psychology. I have a doctorate in social psychology. I taught psychology at the university level as a lecturer and also in community colleges. Spent 10 years on the ground in the California Community College system after being in industry as a strategic consultant, and at Foothill College in the Bay Area and Skyline College in the Bay Area. And increasingly got involved. We used to teach multivariate statistics and research methods and strategic data type courses. And in industry, I worked with companies on kind of culture of inquiry, culture of evidence around data, how to target data to business problems. And I also taught in education on those topics. And about 10, 12 years ago, started trying to help the state of California think about how to use data better, how to ask better questions, how to target it to reform efforts around the country. And then in 2010, a couple of things started happening. Nationally, the movement nationally around student success efforts. I mean, community colleges have always been, I would argue, the engine of innovation in higher education. Right? I mean, we're using a model here in community colleges that, depending on who you listen to, is about 800 years old. Right? We argue sometimes in the U.S. where it started. Some people argue it started in Europe, in Italy, and in France. Others will argue it started in North Africa. Some people argue it started in Asia. But this university model that is eventually the underpinnings of our system is about 800 years old. And who was it designed to serve, by the way? Who was the university mind designed to serve 800 years ago? The rich offspring of the ruling elite, right? The only people who went to higher education were the rich and the elite. I meant the male at the start, right? This was not designed for the masses, right? And if you take the model of higher education, this university model, forward into the early 20th century here in America, go into a university or go to University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1910, 1920, didn't look much different than it did at Oxford in the 1400s and the 1500s. We were still serving the offspring of the ruling elite. And then we in the U.S. did some interesting things. We did two things mainly to democratize higher education. What were they? The GI Bill was the first one. After World War II, we opened the door to millions, what became millions of veterans. And actually, it wasn't all egalitarian at first. It was mainly white males at first, but then it opened up more to women and to students of color. And then the second thing happened because of that, which was us, the community and technical college system, because we didn't have room for those millions of students that we opened the doors to with the GI Bill in land-grant universities. So you see three things happen in the 50s, 60s. How long have we been around here at Western Technical? So you're one of the older systems, right? The technical college system is one of the kind of anomalies in when most community colleges and technical college started. A lot of them started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Also true of the regional four-year schools, by the way. I don't know when the university next door started, but my guess is it hasn't been around since 1912 either. Has it? Wow, you guys have a cool system here. That's very rare. But community colleges and technical colleges were our answer to how do we serve students in a new world order where we've opened the doors on access. Now, one might look at the data on higher education attainment and suggest that while we hit a home run on access, we have a small problem, is that the success didn't follow it, right? So we're going to show you some data on who accesses higher education and where, talk about some economic mobility data, but at the end of the day, the model we have still works really well if you have time and resources. It doesn't work that great if you don't have time and resources. And I think the technical college system, by the way, is one of the systems that is maybe an asterisk on that statement, because we do still a better job in the technical college system of serving a wider range of students, but we certainly have many areas of opportunity ahead of us to helping more students get through, earn a living wage, and start themselves on a career pathway, whether they go directly into a job as the first step on a career pathway, or they transfer to a four-year institution with junior standing in a major. There's a lot we can do on that, and when we started looking at student success, like, how many of you were here in 2002? How many of you could have told me your completion rate in 2002? Oh, one person, nice, that's very good. Like, we didn't have the data, right? We didn't really look at data back then. The data kind of came around in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, as we had better and better databases. And then we started asking some hard questions, like if I got 100 students starting here, how many of them actually complete something? Complete what they were trying to complete in my program or at the institution? I mean, we were just talking about your averages here at Western. I mean, if you kind of add, it depends on, this is one of those numerator-denominator questions. But if you ask who completes a certificate of a year or more, or a degree, or transfers upward to a four-year institution, you guys are probably a little bit above the national average in the low 40s, right? Which of course means that 50 to the upper 50% of your students don't reach their goals. And we're going to talk a lot about how to help more of those students reach and complete their goals. But about 10 years ago, the data started becoming more clear. Folks at the Community College Research Center at Columbia started helping study community colleges, and there were a couple things that happened. One, there was this paper that came out about 10 years ago, and it was a paper written by Judith Scott Clayton at CCRC. And what she had done is dozens of focus groups with community college and technical college students, and was trying to get an image like an image to share their struggles. And she wrote a paper called The Shapeless River. And The Shapeless River was her visual of what it's like to be your average community college or technical college student. By the way, more true of community colleges, where it's, you know, it's like being in a jungle at night on a winding river in a canoe with no lights and no moon. You're nearly guaranteed to run aground at some point, and once you do, it's really hard to get back and be pointed in the direction where you're going, right? So that was a kind of an early stage in the Guided Pathways movement. Then Davis Jenkins is usually considered the father of Guided Pathways because he started a lot of this work at CCRC, wrote a paper called Get With a Program, where he asked a really interesting research question. I wonder what happens if I study the graduation and completion rates of students who concentrate in their first year, meaning they're either in a program or they're taking courses from a program area. What we really want to know is who's in a program, right? How do people who get into a program in their first year do versus students who are kind of wandering, trying to find themselves? And so when he did this research, he found that if students concentrated in the first year, close to half of them graduated within 3 years. For those who didn't find themselves in the first year and were non-concentrators, it was closer to 15%. And by the way, the hypothesis we always had about those students when this data came out, it's okay, they graduate later. It turns out that's actually not true, right? If you follow those students forward 4, 6, 10 years, the vast majority of them don't find themselves. And so this was kind of the genesis of the Guided Pathways movement. And this big ideas that came out of it were students need more structure, they need a guided journey, we need to be monitoring their progress. This came to be the kind of underpinnings of the Pathways movement. And then in 2011, the first National Pathways project was Completion by Design, which was a project that served 9 colleges in 3 states. There were 3 in Ohio, 5 in North Carolina, and 1 in Florida, Miami-Dade. And Chris and I were both involved in that project all the way back in 2011, so it's been a 9-year journey now with Guided Pathways. And we didn't really know what we were doing. We had these big ideas. The colleges didn't know what they were doing. They had agreed to get like $2 or $3 million each from Gates for the privilege of trying to figure out what we were doing. And over the 3 or 4 years of that project, we really got a lot of sense into how to help colleges with Guided Pathways, what they really were. We got clearer about the big ideas. We identified what we now call the 4 pillars of Guided Pathways, which I've seen in some of your strategic documents, that we need to clarify the paths for students. We need to get students on the path. We need to keep them on the path. We need to ensure that they're learning. I mean, those are nice 38,000-foot ideas, and we spent a lot of time over the last 4 to 6 years trying to talk about what does that look like in practice. And so if you fast forward so we can kind of get into the heart of this, 2013, the National Association, the American Association of Community Colleges, releases a report that basically says community and technical colleges need to rethink how students enter and move through our institutions so that more of them can complete. 2015, that same organization now runs a National Pathways project with 30 colleges agreeing to implement Guided Pathways at scale by fall of 2018, which was a very aggressive timeline back when we knew less. One of the colleges in Wisconsin was part of that cohort, Northeast Wisconsin and Green Bay. We did an excellent job as a part of that project. There were 30 colleges from 17 states. There's been a second version of that AACC Pathways project, which includes Milwaukee Area Technical College in it. And now there are state-level guided pathways projects in 13 or 14 states through the Jobs to the Future Student Success Center. I run the one in California. And there are dozens of other colleges engaged in how do we take these big ideas. And that's the thing about guided pathways we're going to talk about. These are a series of big ideas. Guided pathways is not, you can tell a guy who wears Hawaiian shirts and Air Jordans is not going to be, here's your 7-step process, just go through this, here are your colored steps, this is the binder off the shelf, you've done guided pathways. Anyone who tells you guided pathways is that either doesn't understand it or is trying to sell you something, right? Guided pathways are a series of big ideas, and at the end of the day, if you leave this with one thing today, at the end of this, it's that the idea that you here at Western get to design your version of guided pathways and the version of the student experience you want to see at scale for all of your entering students. Kat in the intro referred to, you guys, we've been listening to your team this morning about some of the great stuff you have in place already. You do some really cool things here that are completely consistent with the ideas of guided pathways. And you have other things that it sounds like you can build on, that you might need to build forward. But I would leave this knowing that if, as Western goes down this path, it's part of your strategic plan, this is design work. This is not implementing someone else's model. This is you getting to decide, hey, but here's a question I would have asked you. You actually have a pretty good answer to this already. How do you help students explore careers, match their interests to careers, and actually pick a program? That's one of the important tenets of guided pathways, right? And I was here this morning taking notes as you guys, I didn't ask that question. You guys were just, your leaders were telling us, hey, here's what we do at Western. I mean, your career coaches is a great answer to that question, right? The idea that we're embedding people in the high schools, we're embedding people with returning adults. We have these people who are dedicated to onboarding new students, helping them explore their interests and careers. Maybe it could be optimized in some ways, but you have a feature already in place that is very hard to build at most colleges, right? Some colleges do that by teaching a mandatory first semester class. Other colleges do it by hoping someone clicks on the link to Career Coach and that's going to take care of the problem, right? So the point here is that that notion of how do students do career exploration is one you get to design. You have a decent answer to this already. You can evolve it. But over the next couple of years, as you guys are building this notion of what guided pathways looks like at Western for Western students, I would encourage you to think of it as design work. And the reason for that is because you get to be part of the teams that will get to design these experiences for your students. And so what we're going to do over the next period of time, that was my little soliloquy. We're actually going to kind of turn it to you pretty quickly. We're going to do these things here. We're going to kind of take the pulse. I'm going to have you all pull out your phones for a second. Usually people tell you to silence them. I'm going to have you take them out. We're going to talk about a couple of poll questions about guided pathways. Then we're going to go through kind of the urgency and the case for change, kind of the notions of social justice and economic mobility. I'm going to share some of your own data. I was going to say, I'm going to share your own danger with you. That's not what we're going to show you some dangerous data. Data with you on the momentum metrics at Western. And then I'm going to give you an overview of guided pathways and let you guys ask dozens of questions along the way. I was when a kid, when I grew up in San Jose, in East San Jose, I wanted to be three things. I wanted to be a medical doctor, which, see, that's what happened when I wanted to be a medical doctor. Something made noise and it didn't happen. No. I wanted to be a medical doctor. That lasted exactly until organic chemistry, sophomore year, spring quarter, when, to the great delight of everyone in this country who might have been my patient, organic chemistry got me out of being a doctor. I also wanted to play third base for the Oakland A's, to replace Carney Lansford, who was my hero in the late 80s. That's dating you there in baseball reference. Made it to semi-pro as a third baseman. Wasn't going to happen. The third thing I wanted to be was a game show host. That's the one I'm going to do with you today. So I actually get to live that one out. We're going to have some fun along the way here. I hope you'll find that Chris or anyone else I bring with me on these trips, well, this is really serious work we're doing, but we have to smile and laugh at times because you guys are all working really hard at this. You guys are dedicated to student success, and we're hoping to help be a part of your ride to take it to the next level, but we'll have some fun along the way. And so pull those phones out, and I'm going to ask, we're going to go to the following website, Slido, SLIDO.com. We're going to go to slido.com, and you're going to enter the code in the lower left-hand side here. The code is ROB137, and you are going to tell me the answer to this question. What is the first word that comes to mind when I ask you how you feel about guided pathways right now? So Slido.com, Rob137, what's the first word that comes to mind when I ask you how you feel about guided pathways right now? I always want to see the first word come up because it means the technology. There we go. Hopeful. Work. All right, these word clouds are awesome. By the way, there is no filter here. If you get saucy, we'll see it. Theoretically, it's anonymous, but I can find you. Don't worry. Let's see what we get here. By the way, as a research guy, I know that I should probably hide the screen for the first 30 seconds so that people aren't being guided by what they see up there. All right, we see excited. We got couple of people saying exciting. We got opportunity. We got work. We've got curious. Some people are pumped. That is a serious positive response there. Optimistic. We got hope. We got plan. Complicated, intimidated, both totally fair. Curious. Very fair reaction to this. Where's my skeptical people? I got to find out where the skeptics are. Always a good one. By the way, someone hasn't done it yet, but usually we get a meh. My favorite one of these I did was at a college where the first two words that came up on the screen were meh and eh. I was like, wow, this is going to be fun today. I can tell we're going to have a good time doing this. All right, so we're seeing confused, by the way. Like, what the hell is this? Right? Totally fair. Like, aren't we doing this already? How can we do this? Confused, there's the meh, see, came up twice. All right, so what do you see here? You see a mix, right? You got a mix of people who see this as challenging. Some people are thrilled, they're intrigued, there's hope, the idea of a plan. So you've got a mix of reactions. By the way, could not be more common for a word cloud at a college exploring guided pathways as you are right now. All right, I'm going to ask you a second question. By the way, this is totally, I think, a great set of answers. We're going to go back into this. Stop this one. Start this one. This is now a multiple choice question. You're going to answer A, B, C, D, or E. You don't need to type the Rob137 anymore. Which of the following statements best represents your view of why more students don't complete college? So we said maybe a little more than half of the students who start here don't complete, which again is above the national average. Is it 90% student issues, 10% issues the colleges control, all the way to the other direction of 10% student issues, 90% issues the colleges control? So I'll give this a couple seconds to weave through here. It's always, as a data guy, the real-time reinforcement of data and it's exciting. I mean, I know that makes me weird, but that's okay. There's many other things that make me weird, too. Baldwin, who knows me, is agreeing with that. All right, so what are we seeing here? We're seeing a mix of responses, and we're seeing a mix of, this usually resembles something along these lines. Very few people are at either pole, where it's either 90% college issue, 90% student issues. We have a mix. So the most common response, 70% student issues, 30% issues colleges control, followed closely by 50-50, and then still fairly high from 30% student issues, 70% issues colleges control. So why do I ask this question? Because what we're measuring here is your agency. Is your belief that you have the ability to change the conditions so that more students complete? Now, I always say this at this point, not ahead of the survey, because if I did it at the start of the survey, I'd get a different answer. I tell colleges, there's not a right answer. Like, this is your perceptions. But if I was at a college that chose all A, or 90% of the college said, it's 90% student, 10% issues the colleges control, I would drop the proverbial or the literal mic and walk out and say, refund the money. Why? Because you actually don't believe you have any agency to change outcomes. The outcomes are what they are, and the system is what it is. Right? I think there's evidence to suggest that that's not true, but it would be a perfectly defensible thing. There's just no reason to try at that point. If the issues are all the student, then why are we doing any of this, right? I think it was Deming who said every system is perfectly designed to get the outcomes that it has, right? So I would argue these are systemic issues, right? Because the outcomes are what the outcomes are, right? We occasionally talk about if we just had better students, but I don't know when we're looking back to that we had better students, because when I look at most community colleges' completion rates, they've been the same for a very long time. And my analysis of why that is, by the way, is what I term old school innovation dominating us. What is old school innovation? So if you take the word change, we do capital C change in like 40-point font for really tiny numbers of students. These are what we call sometimes boutique programs where we really change the approach significantly for small numbers of students. And then we use lowercase c change in like 2-point font for the large number of students. And then we sit back and go, I wonder why outcomes didn't change. Because you didn't actually try to change outcomes. You either changed a lot for small numbers of students or nothing, or there is something very small for large numbers of students. You weren't actually trying to change outcomes at scale. So if you want to change outcomes at scale, we have to change big things for all students, or most students. And that's one of the big tenets of guided pathways, is how do we design these new student experiences at scale for all entering new students. But what I want you to leave this with is, so there are C, D, and E. You've got 55, 60% of you who think at least half, whoa, what happened there? At least half the reasons more students don't complete college are in the college's control. And another third of you, at least, think that at least a third of the reasons more students don't complete are in the college's control. As far as I'm concerned, that means nearly all of you believe there's things you can change at the college so more students will complete. So what does that mean? You have agency. Don't forget that you have agency, right? Because there is this tendency, I find this highly ironic. I sit through a lot, I may go to a lot of state and national things and college things, and I always hear, like we always talk about some of these non-cognitive things we want to see in our students. Right? What are always the popular ones we talk about? We want our students to have a growth mindset. We talk a lot about growth mindset. And then we say we want our students to have productive persistence or grit. Right? We also often get kind of preachy about students not having those things. And then I observe that a lot of times we don't turn that lens on ourselves, and we have incredibly fixed mindsets as colleges, and we have no productive persistence or grit. Right? We try something new, we give a group of people a semester and 30 students, we don't like the outcomes right away, and we kill it. I call that death by pilot. You actually were hoping to kill it when you tried it, you never had any intention of scaling it, right? It's a different question to ask, what are the things we can learn, hey, growth mindset, get better at, productive persistence and grit, and stick with over time? We know what the old system produces. It has produced the same outcome for decades. Same outcomes at Western, same outcomes where I worked in California. There's always variances based on your program mix. So one of the hats I wear is I work on the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. I've been doing that since the first round. So I help pick the finalists, and then I help do the site visits. I think I've done about half of the site visits on the finalists for the Aspen Prize. And so one of the things I always find interesting is that when you talk to colleges about the site visits for the Aspen Prize, every single college I meet likes to tell me that they are 100% committed to student success at their college. And by the way, I believe every single one of those applications or interviews I do. But when I ask the next question, which is, all right, so if you're 100% committed to student success at your college, tell me how the student experience is different this fall than it was 5 years ago at your college. The actual student experience. Because unless you have a 90% completion rate, and you don't, the highest in the country is from Lake Area Technical Institute in Watertown, South Dakota, Aspen Prize winner, not because of this alone, 83% completion rate. By the way, interesting story there. They're an anomaly. They're only technical programs. They don't have your ASLA or ASLA. They don't have that program. They only have technical programs. Now, there are lots of colleges that only have technical programs that have 60, 65% completion rates, which is still, by the way, very good. Lake Area is interesting because you cannot go there without knowing what your program is. You enter one of their 27 programs day one. So their entire recruiting and onboarding is about getting you into the right program. And you might think it's selective. The only selective program is nursing. They actually convert 90% of students who are interested in the college in the spring into one of those 27 programs in the fall, which is a number that I guarantee you is much higher than your number. Right, because the average community college or technical college may convert 50 to 60, 70% of even applicants to that. So their story is very interesting. But if you're like a Western Technical, or take one of the colleges in California I work with, they have a 30% completion rate. You guys are maybe 45. So if you have a 45% completion rate and you're 100% committed to student success, that should tell us that you're constantly trying to figure out how to change the student experience to improve that. But when I go to most colleges and ask them, how's the student experience actually different this fall than it was 5 years ago? At most colleges, there are not good answers to that question. And we added mandatory orientation. I like mandatory orientation, but I asked the question then, So how much did you expect your completion rate to go up by when you just added mandatory orientation? No one's ever answered that question with an answer more than 0.5%, which I think is still too high. I don't think it's even that high. Which doesn't mean mandatory orientation's bad. It means it's got to be a part of a larger change effort that covers the entire range of the student experience. Right? Back in completion by design, our framework was students move through a predictable set of stages: connection to the college, entry to the college, progressing through the college, and completing. And there are loss and momentum points at each of those 4 stages. If we're going to design the ideal student experience, we have to think about what's ideal up front. By the way, you do many other cool things here, but this notion of these career coaches is an attempt to try to redesign the student experience. That would be a great answer to this question when I asked it. Now, there's some other answers to the questions that you guys have, but as you unfold this student success mission, like, we have to be constantly evolving the student experience to try to get better, and at most colleges, we don't actually see that. So the reason this is important is you guys are telling me you have agency. I mean, whatever industry change model you want to talk about, they almost always start with, we have to believe we have a problem. It's also apparently AA. But we have to believe we have a problem, right? Admit we have a problem. And then you have to believe you have the ability to change the conditions that led to that problem. So you just told me you believe you have the ability, or maybe that it's possible, to change some of the conditions that lead to student problems. So that's the agency. And now we're going to go back into the PowerPoint and talk about urgency. So do we have a problem? Well, I'm going to argue that we do. And the way I'm going to do that is by exploring an interesting topic. By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier. I have great friends I do this work with, Chris Baldwin Consulting being one of them, but the folks at Community College Research Center at Columbia, the American Association of Community Colleges, Aspen I mentioned I worked with, SESI, the folks down in Texas, Jobs for the Future, and SOVA. We all work together on this. It's like a merry band of 15 of us who, like, in various forms do this work around the country. I'm very appreciative of their efforts. You'll see a lot of slides from me, from CCRC. They're from all over the place. I just want to always attribute that first. We did the poll questions. All right, so let's talk about the social justice and economic mobility underpinnings of what you're trying to do here at Western Technical College. So let me ask you this question. So let's take economic mobility for a second. So the idea that one of our goals in higher education is to help students move from their historical place in the economic spectrum to a better place, right? That's not the only goal of higher education, right? It's true that higher education is about more than just economic mobility. By the way, what are some of those other things? Higher education, yes, economic mobility is one of the things we want for our students. What else do we want to see in our students? What is higher education trying to do? Say that more? Empowerment. Say a little bit more. Empowerment to do what? To be what? So self-confidence. So kind of some of the self-actualization type things we hope, right? I always point out, that's a great one, by the way. You can't be self-actualized till you have food, hunger, and shelter met, right? But I agree. We couldn't agree more that that's a big piece of it. How do we self-actualize? How do we create more confident students and learners? What else? What are other things we're trying to do? I can sit here uncomfortably. It's okay. I'm good with silence. Be a contributor to society. So this is kind of under the heading of citizenship, if you will, right? To be a contributing member in society. Absolutely. That's a goal of higher education. Any other ones? Say more. Security? How so? Yeah, so that I think comes back to the economic mobility. Like, we're trying to get people a living wage and a family-sustaining wage. By the way, this idea that a family-sustaining wage is a goal of higher education is a relatively recent addition, right? Because we got a lot of programs that don't lead to living wages, and we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about those programs, right? Some of those programs are a stepping stone to a living wage, and some of them are a stepping stone to a living wage on paper that doesn't turn out that way in practice. So we have to ask really hard questions about that. This is a not easy part of this work. And then we have to ask some equity questions about who's in the program with low wages and who's in the program with high wages. Because if you run the demographics, by the way, of your nursing and maybe your engineering programs, and then run the demographics at a college of, say, cosmetology and early childhood education, and look at those two groups and tell me how you feel about that, like collectively as a kind of institution of higher education that's with equity and social justice as a goal. Not to saying you caused that problem, but that's a real thing we have to deal with, right? And I don't know that it's necessarily a guided pathways idea per se, although it's certainly relevant about starting with the end in mind, and that end being either a job with a living wage or transfer to an institution on the path to a job with a living wage. Those are both great goals of higher education. Any others? Yes. Yeah, say more. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, so Laura Rendon, was he at UTSA? I think UT San Antonio, talks a lot about especially low-income students, first-time students, college students, and students of color needing to feel validated by the educational system, that their experience matters and that they are worthy of moving up the educational and the social chains. I could not agree more. That's a huge piece of what we do. Yes, what else? Hope. Guess what? Great word. By the way, fascinating little body of research on hope. There's a college in California, Chaffey College in Southern California. Now, I cannot make this up. You would think I was making this up. The woman who runs this project at Chaffey, her name is Laura Hope. And they have something they call the Hope Scale, which they didn't create. It actually is a thing. So on their application, they actually give a 7-item questionnaire. It's a 7-item Likert scale about generalized hope about the world and their future in it. And they have found that that is more predictive of completion rate than any assessment test, high school GPA, or anything else they measure, is that a student's hope is actually the single most predictive thing that they measure. Well, just think about that for a second. We spend all this money on Accuplacer. We start looking at high school GPA, all of which matter, by the way. And the question is, can you change hope? And the answer is yes. You can actually give people hope, right? You can give people a promise of a better future. So that's a great one. I'll throw a couple others out in the interest of time. Lifelong learning. Like we're trying to create lifelong learners so that it's not just this experience, that there's other things people throw out are like critical thinking, right? We want students to be able problem solvers in the real world. Look, I agree with every single one of those are critical pieces of higher education. I'm actually going to make the case in a second on critical thinking. It's probably more important today than it was 50 years ago. But then ask yourself this question. What percentage of students attend your college solely for the love of learning? Throw a number out. Come on, try. What percent do you think that is? One's, yeah, there you go. 5, yeah. By the way, and let's be clear, I don't think this is a whole lot different at the 4-year college next door. Maybe it's different in an Ivy League school, maybe not by much. So I actually, by the way, I had a chance to get some real data on this. This about a year ago. Someone came up to me at a session I was doing and said, hey, you know that question you were asking about the love of learning? I've been as a sociology instructor. She taught Soc 1. So the first day of classes, she always gave a questionnaire to find out more about her students. She asked a multiple choice question about why you're primarily here at the college, and one of her 10 multiple choice answers was for the love of learning. And I'm like, oh, cool, we can find out some data. Like, we've been guessing for years. I don't know what the number is. Hey, there's 10 answers, there's 10 multiple choice items. What is it, 10% said that? And she said, percent? I haven't had a single student choose it in 13 years. Like, oh, man, you would have thought accidentally someone would have filled the bubble in 13 years. I mean, I don't know how the hell that happens. I did the math. There was 3,500 students at the Alamo Community Colleges. By the way, who loves learning a lot? Us. Seeming disconnect. We love learning. And by the way, we absolutely should try to catalyze a love of learning in our students. That actually isn't the point here. The point is, though, that they're here because it's a path to a better life. It's a path to a career. I will tell you, I was an undergrad because I could hit a curveball and took test well at Stanford in the late 80s. And if you had let me, I would have gotten like 8 PhDs. Like someone paid me a living wage. Like I'd have 8 PhDs right now. Right, I'd have one in, I'm not very religious, comparative religion, just for the hell of it. I'd have one in philosophy. The hell of it thing was funny. I didn't even get that. It's not funny if you have to call it out, but it was pretty funny. I would have one in civil engineering so I could figure out traffic. I don't understand it. No one wants to go that slow. Yeah, when lanes merge, I get it completely, right? That's traffic. But I travel all over this freaking country on 200 days a year on the road. I'm tired of sitting somewhere where there's no reason there's this traffic. But anyway, so the point being, I love learning. I love learning. But somewhere around my junior year, I was low income. I grew up in East San Jose in California. I was in the lowest income decile. Started occurring to me, hey, you may love learning, but this better pay off at some point. right? This better pay off at some point. How many of you took student loans when you went through college? How many of you are still paying them? How many are in your 40s and still paying them? Yeah, and by the way, we're the winners. Yeah, I turned 50 in 3 weeks or 5 weeks or something, so I'll be soon in that group. Yeah, and we're the winners, right? We have careers, right? So this notion of economic mobility is incredibly important. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about loan default rates. I have one piece of data in there on them. But the key here is that the students are not here for the love of learning. They're here for economic mobility. They're 98% career focused. By the way, if I'm not at a technical college, I say the same thing. Because if you're a transfer student in psychology, you're wondering what you're going to do with that. By the way, speaking of psychology, my field, it's the number 2 undergraduate major in this country is psychology. At any given time, 15% of American undergrads are psych majors. Which of course begs the question, what percentage of people in the workforce are psychologists? It's 0.3%. And by the way, do you think all those psych majors know that you need a master's or a doctorate to be a psychologist? Right, now you may make the argument that a degree in psychology trains you to do many different things. I think that's a great argument. Guess what we never make? That argument, right? We act as if our job in higher education is often to find the next generation of people to study psychology, right? Now look, you guys are at technical college, it's a little different, although you're comprehensive, right? You have this kind of dual mission. You're one of the states where the technical college used to be one thing, now it's another thing, it's morphing, it's never quite comfortable. Georgia's another state like this, Kentucky. So this is not an issue for you, but I think you guys may sense more than most that your students are career focused, whether it's directly to the workforce in 12 weeks, or it's the first 2 years of a 9-year path in education, right? I do think none of this means the liberal arts education isn't important. There's a number of reasons for this, and this is something that is important at a technical college. The people who are directly entering into the workforce, especially for the lower level certificates, let's say they're making $21,000 after they get their certificate. That's a lot of money to a 19-year-old. It's not a lot of money if you're 33 with 2 kids. You want to buy a house, right? So technical colleges, and maybe especially, have to think about the progression from stage 1 jobs to stage 2 jobs to stage 3 jobs and stage 4 jobs, and people changing industries. Right, so if you guys train someone to be a dental hygienist here, and after 5 years of that graduate of being a dental hygienist says, you know what, I'm actually kind of tired of sticking my hands in people's mouths. You could see that happening. I guess that happens. I want to go back to school and be a small business accountant. All right, cool. Not a bad change, right? So how many of those dental hygiene classes that student took are going to translate to when they go back to school for small business accounting? 0. What is going to translate? The things they took in general studies, right? Computation, communication, critical thinking, what they took in English, what they took in the social sciences. That kind of liberal arts underpinning, right? I don't know what your outcomes are, your gen ed outcomes or your liberal arts or institutional outcomes. They're all like mad libs of the same 5 words. Critical thinking, computation, communication, citizenship. We had creativity. They were the 5 C's at my college. But those are the things we say. That's the heart of what you get with a degree. Ironically, if you talk to employers and you do graduate surveys, if you're graduate to your programs, and what you ask them, hey, how are our graduates doing when they're in your office or they're in your company? What do they nearly universally say that our students struggle with? Critical thinking, problem solving, communication, working in groups, like the things that are the very heart of a liberal arts education, right? So this stuff matters even in quote unquote career technical programs. By the way, we have so many false dichotomies in higher education. One of them is that we have these technical programs and we have these transfer programs. My other favorite one is at colleges to say, here are our technical programs, here are our academic programs, which is incredibly freaking insulting to those people who teach in these technical programs. You tell me arc welding isn't an academic exercise that involves physics, that involves a lot of mathematics and calculus. You tell me aircraft repair doesn't have complicated academic concepts in it, right? This is a very false dichotomy. And by the way, I will show you some schools whose transfer rate among their technical programs is actually higher than their transfer rate among their liberal studies and general studies programs, right? So even if they're going to technical programs first, you'll often find the transfer rate equally high for students who told you they were here to transfer. And by the way, every single one of those transfer students wants a job. So that false dichotomy that's not the point we're trying to make here. The point we are trying to make is one potential responsibility for you as a primarily technical college is to make sure that you're putting students on a life education path that's going to get them past that first job, right? I think a transportation, distribution, and logistics is potentially a great example of this. You could give someone a 6-hour training to be a forklift operator, they make $17 an hour, right? At the other end of that career pathway is supply chain manager at FedEx, who makes $200,000 a year and makes a master's degree, right? That's a career path. Not everyone gets from step 1 to step 10, but if only people get to step 1, they're never moving along this path. And so this notion of economic mobility is important. Wow, and then I turned it off. That's how important it is. Who's it most important to? Well, turns out, not surprisingly, if you're poor, economic mobility is really important, right? Having grown up in that lowest income decile. If you are rich, your job is to stay rich. Now, some might argue, this is not going to get political too much, although I can't help myself, that we have a system designed in this country to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. Right? Now, you can be on any side of the political spectrum. That's not the point. But you might argue that that's what's happened in this country. But the point about economic mobility is, wherever you are politically, is the same. How do we move people from where they are? How do we combat intergenerational poverty? And the other thing I will say is we can't be afraid of talking about race. I stand in front of you as a white male. I don't know if you noticed that. But I would submit to you that if we, the white males of this country, don't talk about race and go ahead and be uncomfortable talking about it, we cannot take this problem of equity, take this problem of social justice, and layer it only onto our administrators, faculty, and staff of color, because they're already dealing with issues of systemic and institutional racism and being the minority. They can't be the ones to solve the problems alone. So we have to work together on it, right? I think whatever positional privilege we have to use it to have real and honest conversations. What I like to say about this is, these are uncomfortable conversations we have to have about race sometimes. We got to get more comfortable having them. More comfortable being uncomfortable, right? It's hard in this country right now to do that, but to have real conversations about it. And if you think these things aren't related, by the way, ask yourself the following question. Can you tell me a zip code in this country where on average, Latinx or African American citizens have a higher median income than white citizens? It actually does not exist anywhere in the United States. So while it's easier to talk about class and easier to talk about money, we also have to talk about race, because they are, unfortunately, in America, inextricably intertwined. And so I will mention it a couple of times through this, and I will argue that the type of things guided pathways are going to help you do are going to help all students. They are disproportionately going to help students with the lowest social and relationship capital, who tend to be first-time in college students, low-income students, which unfortunately in this country, not because of worth or valor, are students, more disproportionately students of color. Is there white poverty in America? Of course there's white poverty in America. I've driven all over this country. I've seen all versions of it, right? We're not saying we're doing this for one group or another group, but we do have to recognize, going back to it, that the student experience is different for certain students than it is for other students. And be honest about that and open and try to figure out ways to address that, which is, I think, the heart of an equity and social justice agenda. So, all right, some researchers, like this is, I always think of these people. When I think of who in this country cares about the poor, I think Stanford, Brown, Harvard, Berkeley, MIT, and Cambridge, those champions of the poor in America. No, wait, that's not right. So actually, this is interesting. This is a group of researchers. They are econometrics guys. They're data dorks who basically study who gets access to higher education and the economic mobility benefits thereof. If you are a data dork, you'll love, they have data sets you can play with, but they also have done some really interesting analyses. And so the American dream, by the way, we talk a lot about the American dream being dead or alive. Was it ever really alive? But however you define the American dream, the most common version of it is, doesn't matter where you're born, doesn't matter who you're born to, doesn't matter the color of your skin, everyone's got an equal opportunity to succeed. That would be the American dream. Now, so one measure of that might be, let's look at elite private institutions. So theoretically, if the American dream, one measure could be who gets access to the Ivy Leagues, right? Who gets access to the elite private institutions? Now, if income didn't matter, we're not going to even take race for a second. If income didn't matter, if I was to go to see Harvard's entering class, like I was to rank and then I asked the question, where does their parental income rank on kind of the spectrum? And I divided parental income in this country into the top 20%, the second 20, the third 20, the fourth 20, the bottom 20. If I then looked at Harvard, if the American dream on this measure were valid, I would find 20% of Harvard students from each of the 5 income brackets, right? Here's what you actually find. Now, this isn't shocking, right? I mean, we assume that it's only the rich to get into Harvard. But I think what's shocking is just how stark this is. 7 out of 10 students who attend Harvard. This data is a little bit old because these researchers wanted to follow the economic outcomes of students. So these are students who started college in 2001, 2002. Not much has changed since then. 7 out of 10 students are from the upper income brackets. And in fact, 5 out of 6 are from the top 2. There are more students from the top 1% than almost the entire bottom 3 income quintiles. It's not just Harvard. If you add in other institutions like Harvard, and actually this is the slide. This is the Ivy Plus. I love this category because it was the researchers on the project saying, well, we want to be in the Ivy League. So now I've got the Ivy League colleges plus Chicago, Stanford, and Duke, who are all researchers on the project. But by any measure, these are elite private institutions, right? And so who gets access? Why does access to elite private institutions matter? Because of the economic outcomes, right? You're not guaranteed unbridled economic prosperity, right? But your chance of it goes way the hell up if you go to a Harvard. I will tell you, I remember every year at Stanford in May, the career fair came to town. And there are about 20 schools in this country where they would come and set up, they being every investment banking and strategic consulting firm in the country. McKinsey, name your investment banking firm, places where you could sell your soul to the devil, work 80 hours a week, and you'd make $150,000. They didn't care what your GPA was. They didn't care what your major was. You could have been a 2.2 philosophy student at Stanford. You could get that job the same way as a 4.0 business student could. There are only a handful of these institutions in the country. Now, you might not want that job. I didn't. I decided to go get in debt and do graduate education for 6 or more years and work in higher education. But the point is, from an economic mobility standpoint, these institutions matter, and it's not true everywhere. So if you add in these Ivy Plus, you again see that these colleges overall have a very similar distribution to Harvard. 15% of the students are from the top 1%, only 4% from the bottom 20. You are, in fact, 77 times more likely to go to Harvard if you're born into the top 1% versus the bottom 20. So clearly, this is not where we're going to work on income inequality in this country, right? It's not at the Harvards. By the way, if low-income students go to Harvard or go to Stanford, they get the same economic benefits as rich students who go there, right, in terms of income. So it actually does balance out. It doesn't balance out family wealth, right? That obviously is different. But in terms of income, it does balance out. So even if you're in the lowest income quintile when you start there, you're one of those lucky few down here, your economic outcomes after going to Harvard are the same as those who started here. I mean, the fact that a lot of these people started with $50 million in the bank is a different story, but from an income standpoint. All right, so if it's not the Harvards of the world, where is it we're going to see the poor students? Well, let's go to the flagships. Let's go to the flagships institutions in every state. So for you guys, it would be Madison, Michigan, Ann Arbor. The researchers chose UC Berkeley. Now, wherever you are politically, I'm sure that you associate UC Berkeley with the left, right? Free speech, Occupy, whatever. I will point out, having been a Bay Area resident for a very long time, there are a lot of Abercrombie and Fitch-like stores in Berkeley. This kind of the whole liberal free speech thing is now very comfortable there. But having said that, you generally associate it with the left, right? But look at Berkeley's ratio. It's not quite as stark as Harvard. I grew up in the Bay Area. This shocked me, that it was that the income disparity of students getting into Berkeley was this marked. You'll see in some flagships, my guess is Wisconsin, it might not be quite this stark, but it's still pretty stark. I was in Nebraska yesterday where I don't think this happens much at all, because when you only have 3 institutions in the state, you start running into the question of, is it really kind of egalitarian by income by the nature of the fact there's only 3 institutions? But it's not the UC Berkeleys of the world, right? So what about the regional 4 years? So the researchers picked SUNY Stony Brook as an example. Any New Yorkers in the room? No New York too? Oh, you. You guys know? You know where Stony Brook is, right? It's like halfway out Long Island. Are there any poor people there? No, there's not poor people within 50 miles of this town, which is shocking, by the way, because one thing we know about low-income students going to higher education, it's really hard to get them to move to regional 4-year schools. They tend to go to the one that's right in town. So I had to do a little research into this, why this happened. Do you know the reason why this happens? It's bridge programs with Harlem and the Bronx and Queens and the Brooklyn before it got gentrified. Like they go into the high schools and they create bridge programs out, and they get, look at this, it's pretty much egalitarian by income. So the regional 4 years are where we start seeing the low-income students, but of course, where does this end? Well, it ends with us, the community college sector, right? This is Glendale Community College in Los Angeles. Now, if you know Los Angeles, you will know that Glendale is not the poor part of Los Angeles, right? Glendale's where the movie studios are. So this is a middle class, perhaps even an upper middle class community. But where do the poor people in that community access higher education? Community colleges, right? So here's the good news. This is incredible news for us as the community college, the two-year sector, the technical college sector. We have hit a home run on access to low-income students, right? What's the problem with this slide, though? Is what you've actually done up here is rank completion and graduation rates from top to bottom. Now, let's be really clear. It is not hard to get a 96% completion rate when you're Harvard, since the average SAT score is 1520, and you need a 4.3 GPA, or apparently, given recent news, about $500,000. But that's a whole different story, right? They don't do much, right? They don't have to do much to get a 96% completion rate. But interesting side note for a second. Anyone have a son or daughter go to an Ivy League or a niece recently? Yes, you? Where'd your son or daughter go? Where'd they go? You don't want to tell me where they went? Okay, that's fine. You don't have to speak. Your husband went to Harvard. All right, so it's an interesting question of whether they were doing this that long ago. The reason I ask about son or daughter is because I like to ask that, was that? Family member. So do you remember any of their onboarding experiences? So like what happened the summer between they got the application, they got the letter of admittance to day one? If you go to an Ivy League school, by the way, that is a very detailed process that often involves 4, 5, 7 days on campus before the first day of classes, right? They're onboarding their students highly intentionally. So pause there for a second. These are the top 1% academically, and Harvard and Brown and Yale are saying they're not college ready. And they're doing things to bridge these students to college. We cover the other 99%, and what do? Next to nothing. Now, I would say you guys here have a couple of answers to this question that most colleges don't, with the career coaches and other things you do. But it is instructive that the Ivy League schools who take the 1% academically are doing this kind of scaffolding for new students. And we say things like our students aren't college ready. Well, neither are Yale's, apparently. Right? So let's stop talking about being the student's problem and talk about how that's our problem. Right? They could blame people too. Right? We could blame K-12, we could blame funding, we could blame lots of things. By the way, there's some blame to be given there. Right? But how do we take ownership over transitioning students into the college? I think you guys have done some good things here already. So the point here is, though, by the way, 95% completion rates. Anyone know what Madison's 6-year completion rate is? It's probably in the upper 80s, like the mid-80s. The better flagships, the Madisons of the world, Ann Arbor, Berkeley, William and Mary, they'll range in the upper 80s to the low 90s. And then some of the smaller state flagships, you're still going to be in the 70s, maybe the upper 60s in the smallest states. Go to the regional 4-year schools. Anyone know what the graduation rate is next door at Wisconsin La Crosse? Sometimes I look that up first. Didn't today. It's often in the 40s and 50s. In some states, it's in the 30s. Then you go to the community college sector. What's the average community college? Graduation with a degree plus transfer plus 1-year certificate or more nationally, it's about 35%. So although we've hit the home run on access, the places where the rich students are going have high completion rates, and the places where the poor students are going have lower completion rates. No one's blaming you. This isn't a blame game. What this does to me is sharpen our mission. Like, how many of you, if you were truly honest with yourselves, and I'm going to include myself in this poll, came to work at a community college or at Western Technical primarily out of a sense of social justice and equity? Okay, that's the average number of hands in a room, about 5 or 6 out of 100. I didn't raise my hand. I came to the community college sector because I was tired of the dot-com crash, and my dad played football at Foothill College, and when I looked on Monster.com and Foothill College came up, I said, hey, my dad played football there. And I looked at the ad, and it was for institutional research. I didn't know what that was. I applied for it. By the way, my dad's famous story about being at Foothill College is that in a game his freshman year, he face-masked O.J. Simpson twice. I don't know where that fits in race relations in this country. Like, I'm not sure where that happens. He was at San Francisco State, but I don't know. A lot of us come to higher ed and come to community college because we care deeply about our field or our discipline or about serving students. But what I would submit to the other 98% of us who didn't raise our hands is, guess what? You are also here for a mission of economic mobility, social justice, and equity, because if we don't do it, no one else is going to. It is that big of a story. By the way, some of the data, let's talk a little bit of data on race for a second. Further evidence of the challenge. So I used to teach a statistics course at the University of Oregon. Interestingly, by the way, this is another Guided Pathways sidelight about what's the right math course. So this idea of alternate math pathways, like not every student needs to be in algebra, what is the right math for my program? Like if you're a psych major, I would argue strongly the right math for you is statistics. Why? Because you need statistics when you're a psychologist. You don't need college algebra. And the research in the field, by the way, on what do students need. So Tony Carnevale at Georgetown at the Workforce Center studied what math do people need in the real world. For college graduates, he found that over 80% of them don't use the math in the algebra sequence. They use the math that's in quantitative reasoning or statistics. Right? So, I mean, that the question of teaching quantitative reasoning or statistics, maybe for the 80% of our students who don't go into STEM or business calculus, is obviously that movement's been occurring the last 10 years. When I was at the University of Oregon, I taught statistics for the social sciences, Psych 301, in 1993. Any ducks in the room? That seems unlikely. Still pissed at you, Big Ten colleges. You keep beating us in the bowls. Freaking Ohio State. He's like an Ohio State fan, so you guys can hate him too. I do too. It's totally fine. I taught at the University of Oregon, and if you were a social science major, that course, Psych 301, Statistics for the Social Sciences, that was your math course. Having taught that course, I will tell you, it was not a math course. It was an applied statistics course. So this idea of what's the right math for a program is not a new idea. It's a new idea at scale. University of South Carolina, I was randomly looking around on their website. If you are not a STEM major at University of South Carolina, you can pass your math requirement at the college by taking a computer programming course. What's the skill we're hoping to get out of our graduates? Computation in the real world. Turns out maybe there's different ways to assess that, right? So these are big ideas. So I always used to give an assignment in my psych class. I'd say, go find me a misleading graph. And this is kind of before Al Gore invented the internet, or whoever did that, I don't know who it was. But I would tell people, because they couldn't go look online, if they ran into a problem, what would you do? Just open any USA Today. You will find yourself a misreading graph on the page 1 of every USA Today that's ever been printed. Why? Because they did a poll, and they said 74% of the people said this, and 72% of the people said that, and they start the axis at 70, so it looks like it was a 2-to-1 ratio of people who said answer A versus answer B. Pretty much every USA Today has that. So this is about lies, damn lies, and statistics. Now, this is not a political statement I'm about to make, but this statement came out a couple of years ago. Hey, great news. From 2013 to 16, the median net worth increased 46% for Hispanic families in this country, 29% for black families, and 17% for white families, right? Isn't that great news? Isn't it great to be black or Hispanic? No, why? What's the question you want to ask? Hey, where did they start? That's a pretty good question. I don't know. Maybe that's a good question. I'm actually not even going to answer that question. I'm going to tell you where they ended after the increases. So after the increases, the 17% increase for median net worth, white citizens are at $171,000 net worth. Hispanic citizens are at $21,000. And African American citizens are $18,000. That's after the increases, right? So you can't tell me race doesn't matter in this country when it comes to economic outcomes, right? This is the playing field that we're working from, right? And I think there's a lot of things we can do on this front, but when you talk about this notion of economic mobility, and yes, there are poor white students in this country and there are poor white citizens, we have a huge obligation to look at the systemic issues that have resulted in this happening and try to work on them. And I would argue, look, you guys are not a place where 80% of your students are minority because you don't have that many minority students in your area, right? When the Aspen Prize looks at colleges and we look at equity, we try to see how representative you are of your community. The community is 10% citizens of color and the college is 5%, well, now you got a problem. If the community is 10% and you're 20% of the college, good first step. Now how do those students do? And what are the systems and structures we can put in place to help them? So this is kind of getting to the, wow, I left out the N on Western. You guys are now Wester Technical College. Started by the famous man, George Wester, who I don't know who that was. All right, so we got some data. So furthering the case for urgency, brought some data to the table. Tracy and her team sent me some metrics. What are the metrics we're going to talk about? I talked a little bit about this before the Guided Pathways movement came along. By the way, when the Guided Pathways movement started, we were forced to measure 32 variables at every college to try to see how things were going. They were called key performance indicators. And I missed like one meeting in those first 2 years, and I got assigned the task of helping the colleges set targets on these 32 variables. That was a bad meeting to miss, I will tell you, because that was one of the least favorite things I've done in higher education. Look, in the end, we want to move completion, not just completion. We want to move the things that happen after completion, wages in the marketplace, completion after transfer. We absolutely want to measure those things, but I can guarantee you one thing, and that if I was to tell you, hey, I'm going to share with you your latest data of your 6-year cohort that started in 2012, you'd go to sleep. Because no one wants to hear what happened 7 years ago, right? So our goal was to find a set of shorter-term metrics that are predictive of longer-term outcomes, and we were able to do that at CCRC, primarily with some help from me and others. We have these, what we call momentum metrics. And these are variables that are highly predictive of downstream completion. They are these college-level credit thresholds. How many students who start here finish 15 or 24 or 30 college-level credits in the first year, or 6 and 12 in the first term? Those are highly predictive. These are also highly predictive. Completing gateway or transfer-level math and English completion in the first year. Highly predictive of downstream success. Fall to spring persistence, course level pass rate, units attempted in first term, first year. In fact, CCRC just completed a study that if you use these 8 variables to try to predict downstream completion, this will be good for the math dorks like me in the room, the predictability, what's this variable called R squared, so the predictability you can get from these 8 variables of downstream completion is over 80%. When you get an R squared of 0.3, it's usually very high. R squareds of 0.8 are insane. By the way, if you add demographics on top of these variables, race and gender and others, it only increases your predictability by a half point. So that, by the whole way about demographics being determinant, no, demographics aren't determinant. Hitting these milestones is determinant. Right? You want to fix the equity problem, fix the ability of students to hit these milestones. Highly predictive of downstream success. Okay, so let's look at your data. Now I'm going to share, this is a paper if you want the backdrop on this from CCRC. I'm going to have your data, more correctly spelled with Western, and I happen to have data from a couple of other areas. Maricopa, the 10 community colleges in the Phoenix area, and then the entire states of Connecticut and California. I just happen to have this data. By the way, there's a tendency when you see your name on a chart with another college to just compare. We're beating them, we're losing to them. In addition to doing that, because I'm not going to tell you to not do that because I know you're going to do that anyway, also ask yourself the question, are we okay where this is from an absolute sense? Meaning, if my number's 40, is it okay that 40 are good and 60 are bad? Not 40 is higher than 38, so I beat the college next door, right? So one variable that's really important when you look at this is percentage of your new students who are full-time. You guys are fairly low on this, at around 35%. You're more like California. The entire state is at 35%. Maricopa and Connecticut are a little higher on this. They have a greater percentage of their students are full-time. Why does that matter? Usually, higher percentage of full-time students leads to higher outcomes. Makes sense, right? They've got people more on the path. So let's take a look at the data. Here's the first one, the credits in the first term. You guys actually do really well on first-term credits. Out of the 4 I looked at, you guys were the highest. So 65% of your students get 6 or more college-level units in the first year. Partially that is because you're a technical college and none of the other systems are technical. I think that because of the designation of the way those courses are coded. But even with that, I would argue, that's a pretty good outcome. You've got 65% of your students, 6 units, only about a third of them are getting 12 units, right? Why is that important? Because let's say 60 units is kind of where your degree is. Perfectly on path would be 15 units in one term, right? This is only a third of the students make it to 12. So that is still, even though, as I mentioned, you are doing well there relatively, there's room to grow, right? So let's look at the year-long metrics. Again, you guys do pretty well here. And again, partially, I would love to have the data from another technical college to put on here because I think it would be interesting to see. And you guys aren't exclusively technical, but you are leaning towards the technical side of comprehensive. And all these other institutions that I'm looking at actually lean the other way towards more transfer institutions. You do pretty well here. About half your students get 15 or more students in the first year. A quarter get 24. But remember, this is the 30. That would be perfectly on path. So just pause there for a second. That means that although, hey, look, you doubled Connecticut. Congratulations. 91% of your students are not perfectly on path after a year, right? This one's even more interesting. I mean, only a quarter are 40% of the way there after a year. And barely half are a quarter of the way there. Now, not all of them are trying to get to 60. I understand that, right? Some of your programs are 30 units, some are 15. So you got to work all that in. But you guys do pretty well on these momentum metrics. The next things are a little harder on the next one, which is the math and English. So passing college-level English in year 1. These two numbers, by the way, are very high nationally. This is much more average. 25 to 30, 35%. You're kind of in what I would consider an average range for passing college-level English in year one. And obviously, college-level math, there are systems that are doing much better. You're much more like California. Now, I have heard that there are some things in progress here in terms of multiple measures, in terms of co-rec, that might not be in this data yet, right? Generally, when we see co-rec approaches, the idea that a very large number of your students directly enter the transfer level course, these numbers go up incredibly. College in California, who is the one college that so far has gone fully to co-rec math, they increased their rate from 11% to 70%. And so when you go to scale at co-rec, when you go to scale even at extreme acceleration models, and people take those in the first year, which is a big addition to that, right? Obviously, if you don't try math in your first year, you're never getting on this, right? And there's all the horror stories of what happens when you leave math till the last semester. But some of that is rhetoric, but there is some reality to that as well. But I would expect your number to go up a bunch here if you are doing co-rec at scale, because we've learned this from Tennessee, from Colorado, from California, that if you do this, if you truly go to a model where most students are going into a college-level course in their first semester, or they're going into a 2-semester model of one prep college level, the data is actually shockingly consistent. English numbers creep into the high 60s and low 70s. Math numbers creep into the high 50s to the upper 60s. Look how much bigger those are than we see here. And how transformational that will be for your students to have that math and English. And look, you guys are a technical college with a lot of technical programs. That often is the difference between someone getting an AS degree versus getting a certificate or an AAS degree, right? You have the certificate versus degree thing. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with certain certificates. But what about the lifetime value and earnings of your students who are able to move up and get a degree, right? That's something to keep in mind as you're going through this as well. So this is clearly an area that's under development. Thinking back to my growth mindset rant from earlier, I would strongly urge you to keep that mindset going as you adapt and try to get more and more students into college level and try to support them so they're successful when they get there. Because when you look at this variable and how predictive this particular variable is, it's one of the 1 or 2 most predictive variables of downstream completion. Is how many students are passing this in their first year. So don't lose this as a huge thread. It's an area of opportunity for you that I know some work is underway on already. The other variables on fall to spring persistence. You guys do pretty well on fall to spring persistence. Your term 1 course completion rate's a little lower, right? And this is, why does this matter? Because even if you have the most perfect pathway in the world, if people are only passing the class 5 out of time, 6 out of 10 times, you guys are kind of at 7, a little lower than some comparative states. So that suggests that you have maybe some areas of opportunity to work on course completion. And by the way, holding high standards, right? Holding high standards, but helping students achieve them. Just a little funny story on the side here, hopefully, is that I go to a lot of colleges. I've been to 400 colleges over the period of the last 10 years. I'm on the road about 200 days a year. I cannot tell you how consistent it is that when I come to a college and start talking about either course completion or quality, every single one of you will tell me how your college has got a higher level of rigor and a higher level of quality than insert the blank college next door. Right? So every community college will tell me the name of another community college. Yep, our quality's better than theirs. They're low quality. Here's an observation I would make about that. Since I hear that everywhere, it means one of 2 things. Either you all suck, that's a technical term, right? Either you're all horrible at quality because everyone is saying someone else is horrible, or quality actually isn't the problem people think it is. That faculty across this country are trying to have high standards, they're trying to help students achieve them, and we're actually all working on this. Because I guarantee you, I have never been to a college where they tell me, we actually don't care about quality here. That has yet to happen. So, and by the way, I trust you, faculty in the room, you care about quality. So the question isn't about quality, it's about how do we help students achieve the goals we set out for them. So I do think when you look at course completion rates, there's always that, I bet they just lowered standards. I'm telling you, no one does that, right, intentionally. And so the question is, if you look at a college that has a completion rate that's much higher on their course completion, by the way, you have to ask the question, what's their course mix? Right? If you have a college that is primarily technical, by the way, or primarily in cohort-based CTE programs, you're going to see higher course completion rates usually. than a college that's kind of classically pre-transfer, which is why your data is a little bit interesting on that one as well. But the data is what it is, right? I think given all that you're doing, you have some pretty good opportunity there. And now it is time. I told you I wanted to be a game show host. We're doing it. Some of you are asking, when is this guy going to get to pathways? That's what we're doing. It's one big way. I will tell you that for years, when I did these guided pathways keynotes, we just dive into guided pathways and say, here's what guided pathways is, here's what it's not, here's what you need to do. And I've found over the years that if you don't spend this time talking about agency, talking about urgency, setting the stage, none of the guided pathway stuff matters, right? But we are now going to play a game. That's right. It's time for the feud. You might be asking yourself the question, does he have sound? Oh, yes, I have sound. I've got this. You can tell me later whether I'm more like Richard Dawson or Steve Harvey or I'm woefully inadequate to either one of those. So we are going to ask a question of everyone. You're going to shout out answers. The top 6's answers are on the board to the question, what do new community college or technical college students ask advisors, or coaches in your case, before they enroll in classes? What are the questions your students are asking before they enroll in their first classes? To advisors, to coaches. All right. Top 6 answers are on the board. I surveyed 100 imaginary people. What are some of the things that your new students ask? How much is it going to cost? It sounds like a pretty good question to me. How much is it going to cost? Copyright violations. There you go. Cheer. Hold on. Yeah. What else? How much am I going to make? You get the big one. What are my career options? All right, that's a great one. What else? What was it? Say it again. What courses should I take? Right? You might not have said that, but I'm giving it to you anyway. I'm half deaf. All right, what courses should I take? That seems like a pretty fair question. What else? When will I graduate? How long will it take? By the way, that's a fascinating little question, the way you phrased it. I love the way you phrased it. When will I graduate? Because at a lot of colleges, especially when we have all these part-time students and we feel pretty comfortable, it's okay, they're part-time, they'll graduate eventually. What I would love our advisors to do is to say Chris is a new student, he comes in and he says, I can only take 2 classes a semester. Oh, cool, well then you're on a spring 2027 graduation plan. I don't want to graduate in spring 2027, I don't want to be here that long. Well, guess what? You can't only take 2 courses then, right? This idea that students are part-time and that's a fixed thing, we can't have some ability to change, that's a complete absconding of our agency there too. Right, we can help students. You guys are doing some cool things on student financial stability I already love, and I just heard about them today for the first time. We also can convince our students of a value proposition that might get them to go more full-time. You know what's really hard to commit to? When you don't realize why you're there. Right, so this is an interesting, I love the way you phrased that though. There are colleges who have inculcated their students into a culture where when a student introduces himself, they tell you their graduation term. Chris Baldwin, Psychology, 2021. Right? Hey, now I've got an end game in mind. That is a very cool little feature. Those subtle little things matter. When you're trying to create community, you're trying to create a sense of worthiness and valor, you're trying, hey, here's an idea. How about creating the expectation that someone is going to succeed rather than they're not? Let's start from the idea you're going to be successful and we're going to help you rather than show me why you're worthy of any of us giving you any support. You want to change the paradigm, change it there. Start up front. I love the way you said that. All right, what are the last 2? Do I have to go to class every day? Love that. Love that knows more. All right, what else? Number 5 is related to number 4. How much financial aid can I get? Right? Anyone on the last one? This one's tricky. It's not for. This one's not for all of your students. Will my credits transfer? All right. Anyone look at this list and say, you know, Rob, that's a really unreasonable list for our students to ask? Seems pretty reasonable, right? All right, here's a thought exercise for you. Go into your general studies program for a second, someone who's transferring. And I like to think of students majoring in psychology. I know that's not exactly how it works at Wisconsin. But if I was to grab 10 students out of a Psych 1 class on Monday who started last fall. So they're in a survey course in psychology. They started last fall. They've been here 2.5 semesters. I buy them pizza for lunch, all right? And in that lunch, I show them this list of questions. How many of those 10 students I pulled from a Psych 1? I didn't pull them from welding or dental hygiene for a reason. I pulled them from Psych 1. How many of those Psych 1 students who are in their ninth week of their third semester, are you going to tell me they have great answers to these questions at Western Technical College right now? Out of 10. 1, 3, 4. So I don't know what the answer would be here, because you guys are a little different than a lot of the colleges I go to. But I picked psych for a reason. At most colleges, the number, if you actually do this, is 2. It's just above 2, can be as high as 3. And then if you ask them the next question, hey, what courses do you need to take to finish? Plummets lower, right? So we, by the way, just said these are highly important things for students to know, totally fair for students to know, and a lot of students don't know the answer to those questions. By the way, when you look at the success rate of those students, you find they don't tend to succeed, on average, disproportionately than those who do know the answers to these questions. And the last thing I'll say on this is, if you don't think these questions are important, ask yourself who you're losing students to. What other higher educational institution, type of higher educational institution, is stealing your students left and right because they give good answers to these questions in their marketing? For-profit institutions, our friends, right, who take our students. Like, you guys are down enrollment. You're partially down enrollment because of your 4-year next door. You're partially because the regionals are all competing for the same resources. But you're also down because of for-profit institutions, which is fascinating, because why are for-profit institutions stealing your students? Marketing, right, is the great answer to this question. But the question I ask is, what are they marketing? They're marketing the answer to the first 5 of these 6 questions. They horribly fail at the 6th one, right? But let's for a second pause. Anyone know what the University of Phoenix's graduation rate is? 6-year graduation rate is, or would want to guess? So the major national for-profit that is in the most commercials, their graduation rate is 19%. Whoa, right? Pause for a second. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that we don't have time to go into. I think, as we know, online education is not easier. I think their marketing tells you part of the reason ahead of time is they are always showing some woman in her pajamas late at night who's just put the 3 kids to bed, and now we're very excited she's starting her online education, right? She's usually a woman of color. And they've left out the first 16 hours of her day. Got up, got the kids to school, went to work, got the kids home, homework, dinner, cleanup, kids to bed. She may have a spouse, he or she's probably useless. Now she's doing all this, right? I'm just looking at myself in this. And so now she's starting her online education. And yeah, that seems like a pretty good recipe for success, right? Right? So does it work? Yeah, they have transformational stories. Does it work often? No. I often tell presidents, I have a great new marketing slogan for you here at the college for our losing students to for-profits. And that's, fail with us, it's cheaper. Come on, laugh at that, it's funny. Now, the reason I make this point is these things clearly matter to your students, and a lot of your students don't have them. If I'm in the Surge Tech program, I know the answer to all these questions. I know what I'm taking in the 3rd semester, I know how long it's going to take, I know how much it's going to cost, I know what my career options are. All of that I know. Hey, guess what? You have 75, 80% completion rates in that program. Fascinating. All right, that actually sets up the 2nd round of the prize, because there's always 2 rounds. Let's skip this quick, kind of for time. I realize, for those of you who are my age, I'm also pulling out another 70s and 80s game show, Why Are Blanks So Successful? What is that? Match Game, damn right. See, you can tell who's our age. Like, Match Game 78, I was, of course, -1 at that point, but, you know. Why are blanks so successful? Who are the blanks here? To save some time, cohort-based CTE students. Students who start in a cohort, not just, I love you nursing people, right? The nursing students who start in the RN program, that's not a great example because of the selectivity and the waiting list issues, but any cohort-based technical program, right? Or it's another interesting group of students. You have them. They are exclusively pre-transfer students. They have 75, 80% transfer rates, where your overall rate for most students is 20, 25. Anyone know who this group is? Fascinating group. Athletes. Community college athletes are a fascinating group of students, right? Now, we all know 4-year athletics has some stereotype issues about how athletes do in academics in 4-year schools. 2 things about that. One, we're not talking about Division I men's football and basketball programs where you do tend to see issues with graduation rates. Interestingly, if you look at the overall graduation rate for NCAA athletes, anyone know what that is? 71%. It is 10 points higher than it is for non-athletes. So the rhetoric around athletes not being academically inclined, largely not even true in 4 years. But come back to the 2-year college, we got no scholarships here. We don't have coaches that we're firing in community college athletics based on their record, unless you coach football in Texas, where that does actually happen, because they're crazy down there. You think their football teams would be better, but yeah, sorry, that was a big shot at the Big 12 there. Pac-12, Big 10, we should be on the same place on that. But athletes are highly successful. So do I happen to have any coaches in the room or former coaches of sports? Yeah, if I had the men's soccer or the women's volleyball coach in the room, I'd ask them, hey, how many of your students that started 2 years ago transferred last year? They're going to give me a number that's like either all of them, 70%, 80%, which is fascinating. So these are two groups of students, couldn't be more different. They literally could not be more different. There's no overlap. No one's ever been in the welding program and on the soccer team at the same time. They are completely different cohorts. So the question now is, in the second round of the prize, why are they so successful? What are the 8 reasons that maybe we think these students are very successful? They're goal-oriented. How about number 1, right off the bat? They are highly motivated. Hey, guess what? Apparently what you're motivated by doesn't matter, because they're not motivated by the same things. One of them's motivated by getting into the workforce, getting that job. They might be motivated by the entrance exam they're going to have to take. They're motivated by the wages. The other group's motivated by A, I want to play. And B, maybe they're motivated by, hey, it's kind of cheap here. It's expensive at the other school. When I transfer, if I get a scholarship, I can be motivated by that. Motivation's a big deal. At highly motivated students. What else? Community and belonging. So I'm going to do 2 things here. I'm going to give you that. And also that. Uniforms. He gets double. I added uniforms as a joke when I put it on here the first time, but then I thought about it. It's completely and utterly real. Right? What does uniforms give someone? Sense of belonging, sense of identity, and pride. You want validation? You want belonging? These people travel together in packs, like they wear the uniforms, like they are a visible group. They have an identity on this campus. And then you've got the peer support, right? We're a cohort. We're together. If you're the starting quarterback on the football team, 98 of the other 99 guys want you to succeed. The only guy who doesn't is the backup quarterback. I'd really be happy if you failed. But you've got peer support, right? What else do you have? This is actually my favorite answer. You got a chair or a coach. You've got someone who's in your corner, whose job it is to hold high standards and help you achieve them, right? You've got someone you have an institutional agent invested in your success. Now, good, here at Western, you probably have more students who have this experience relatively than you did at my college, where I only had about a quarter of my students in technical programs and maybe a tenth who were athletes. And, 2/3 of them had nobody in their corner. 0. Some of the the coaching, advising, mentoring stuff that you do here already is a huge step towards this as well. But the chair and their coach are incredibly important people, right? If you run into academic trouble, your chair knew about it before you did, and so did the coach, right? These are people who are monitoring your progress. Really important point. What else? 4 more. I like that one, but because of my previous rant about full-time, I have a much longer rant on the full-time thing. But that, I think, is, by the way, a very good answer. I just don't like it. Yeah. No, you didn't make the list, Baldwin. I did. What else? They have clear course paths, don't they? We already said dental hygiene and surg tech students never what they were taking in the 3rd semester. And athletes are really interesting, by the way, because they don't have a clear course path from the start. What do they have? An advisor who sits down with them midway through every semester and helps them figure out next semester of courses so they can take and stay on path. I'm going to give you another one here that's related to this. Because they have a ticking time clock, if you're an athlete, you got 5 years to play 4, right? 5 years of eligibility to play 4. And if you look at time to degree at most comprehensive community colleges or in your ASLA program, my guess is your time to degree is 4.5, 5 years. You know what it is for athletes in those programs? It's about 2.1, 2.2. So apparently it's not impossible. They're not getting scholarships, by the way. They just get the reins of these other things. So the clear course paths are a big deal. It is a challenge, by the way, for athletes when we talk about success after transfer, because if you don't know where a student's going, it's hard to tell them what courses to take that are going to transfer. So when we know, then we're opening the catalog for Middle Tennessee State to figure out which of these courses I should have them take next semester. But who else do we do that for? Right? We do it for athletes. All right, what are the last 2 here? I'm going to give them to you in the time. How about mandatory support? You don't ask for support. You don't have to raise your hand to get support. It finds you. You're struggling with writing, and you're in the business administration program, the chair of that program gets you help from the writing center, tells you where it is, takes you over there, calls someone from the English department, right? If you're an athlete and you're not in tutoring, you're not playing, right? We have mandatory support. We don't have to find it. And the final thing here I'll throw up here is discipline and accountability, which is the idea. We talked earlier about productive persistence and grit. These students tend to have it, right? They're goal-oriented. And the other thing is on this, they have learned you're not supposed to be good at something before you start studying it. Athletes, by the way, you got to get good at it. I mean, there's 1 out of 100 athletes who's gifted and doesn't have to practice. And if they're in a team sport, they still have to practice. You don't go into the welding program because you're good at welding. You got to fail a lot first, right? And that mindset is really important to these students. They have discipline, they have accountability, and they're used to thinking about things in terms of productive persistence and grit. And so I think this is a very fascinating list, don't you? These are things that take two types of students who are not the same. They are very different students, right? Yet the markers for success are very similar. You might ask why I spent all this time playing a game show, because what we've just done here is give you the big ideas of guided pathways. What are the big ideas of guided pathways? We're hoping to motivate students by having a clear end in mind, the structure of clear course paths. We're going to have people who are monitoring progress. We're going to have embedded or mandatory support structures. We want to create cohorts of peers who help each other. We want to give a sense of urgency to students. We want to hold them to have discipline and accountability, but we also got to do that with ourselves, right? We got to have the same growth mindset we're looking for in our students, the same grit we're looking for in our students. And then maybe the uniforms is probably one step too far. No, you're going to, hey, and by the way, was it Monroe in New York when they did the meta majors thing? They actually, the colors, right? They use the colors. So if you're in science, it's green. If you're in business, it's blue. And what they said happened occasionally was people would come up and say, hey, I see you got a blue thing on. You're in business. What's your name? Right? Just even the students who aren't in cohorts, you can build community and build cohorts. And so what are these big ideas? Well, we've just given you the kind of big ideas of guided pathways. Those other slides are really important, by the way. Big test later. No faculty member's ever done that, just speed through 2 slides and test on it later. That never happens. We don't do that. Actually walked by one of the boards out doing your Student Success Center where students are writing what they're struggling with. And this, by the way, every board I've ever seen like this at every college in the country. What's written on that board? Faculty testing on things they never talked about in the book or lecture. That's been written on every board I've ever seen, was written on your board too. So it's apparently fairly consistent. These are the big ideas of guided pathways. We've got to clarify the paths to end goals. What are the big ideas in there? This notion of meta majors. If a student doesn't know what program they want to go into, right? So they don't know they want to go into the welding program. They don't want to know they want to go into surge tech. How about creating an experience for them that helps them decide? You guys have how many programs here at Western? 100 plus programs, right? That's a lot. By the way, I'm a social psychologist. We'll tell you, where do people get paralyzed with choices? How many choices can we actively decide between? 4, 5, 6, maybe 7. 100's a lot, right? 100's a lot more than that. And by the way, how do you list those programs? We got a catalog and a website, just lists all the programs. Have you ever tried to read the catalog straight through on your program list? How was that experience for you guys? Was it fun? Stab yourself in the ankle halfway through to get out of that test? Why did you have to do that? I don't want to know. That sounds like, it's your job. Well, then you should definitely do it. The point being, this is in no way was the catalog or the website intended to be something that helped people make a choice. Right? It's a list. It's actually to establish catalog rights. It's actually a legal document. That's really why we have that. It's not to help people pick a program. So how do we do that? Well, maybe when students come in and they're undecided, we say, I don't know how many of you have, 4, 5, 6 different, by the way, please don't call them meta majors. It's a really bad word for it. But it came out of Florida legislature. We got stuck with it. But call them areas of interest, focus areas, schools, career and academic academy, whatever you want to call them. Maybe I get to choose between business, social science, humanities, natural science, pre-allied health, skilled trade, whatever the 6 are. By the way, you're going to argue about them for 4 months. When you get to that point, you're going to argue about it. And I will tell you that at the end of the day, no student has ever cared what you called it. Call it Fred. As long as they have the experience behind Fred, you'll be fine. But you're going to craft the experience for them. Hey, how about we create a first semester experience that helps people decide? Right? We're very fond of saying, we got all these undecided students. Why are they undecided? Because we haven't done anything. We actually didn't done anything to help them decide. Now, look, again, I want to say that I've heard today that your career coaches are a big step in that direction, but think of those career coaches paired with this idea of meta majors to create a first semester experience where inside and outside the classroom, you're supporting students exploring themselves and making these informed decisions. That sounds pretty cool. All right, so once I've picked a program, what do I need? I need a default program map, right? You're going to have to map your program. So how does a student get from point A to point B? What are the courses they should take? Maybe in what order should they take them? When do they take math and English, right? We need that on a default program map. Then how about career and transfer information earlier? You are in one of only 47 other states with horrible transfer policy. So unfortunately, sorry, you're in that minority of 48 out of 50. You guys have bad transfer policy in this state. Like, it actually sounds insane to me, even more so than most states, which is saying a lot because it's insane in most states. But I don't know where Psych 1 wasn't Psych 1 wasn't Psych 1, but there's a lot of places in this country where Psych 1 counts some places and doesn't other places. You know who has no idea of that? Your students. And why should they? They assume that every course they're taking here is going to count when they transfer, and I don't know why there's any reason for them to think otherwise. We know different, so we have to tell them it's different. Hey, you want to go, Viterbo. I was so close, I got stuck. You want to go to Viterbo versus Wisconsin La Crosse versus, what was the one across the border? Winona State. You know, that might be 3 different pathways in sociology. The courses they take, because remember, you're not trying to help the students who want to transfer. You're not trying to help them transfer. You're trying to help them transfer with junior standing in a major. That is a very, very big difference, because every 4-year college in the country will accept your units. Acceptability isn't the issue, but do they apply them to junior standing in a major so your students aren't forced to repeat 45 credits when they get there, where it's more expensive, by the way? That problem is kind of invisible to you, because when the students do transfer, you're like, cool, we got to transfer. And unless they're really pissed off when they go there and find out they got to repeat a year, you're not going to hear about that problem. It's a big problem, right? And you guys seem to know a lot about this because one of your transfer partners seems to not be particularly prickly, which is great when it's next door. That's always really helpful. It's really, like, I was driving here last night without knowing this. I'm like, wow, I bet their transfer stuff's pretty good. They've got the 4-year regional right next door to them. This proves that everywhere is different. That's actually not helpful. All right, so these big ideas, and you'll see the 4th thing on the Clarify the Path math pathways. The idea, what is the right math course for my program? Now, I will tell you, because I get to leave today, I've never quite understood, and this happened at every college I ever worked at, why the decision about what the right math course is for a student at the college is the decision of the math department. Because I'm the psych major, don't I want the psychology faculty telling me what's the right math for a psych major? Seems like a pretty interesting idea, because guess what? The right math for psychology and for most psychology students is not algebra. It's statistics. Now, there are some psych students where the right answer is algebra. Those are students who are going into quantitative or neuropsych. So you can see how you can't do math and English, or what we used to call dev ed reform. You actually can't do it without pathways, right? You need to know where a student's heading towards. So what the right math is for them is actually kind of a guided pathways decision. You all get to make it together. By the way, there are colleges I work with where the math faculty write like algorithms for the other areas to say, hey, do your students need to know this? There was the one that's San Jacinto, I think this is. Their math department wrote this questionnaire that the programs filled out about what are the type of skills your students need after they graduate, and it suggested a math course. Quantitative reasoning, algebra, statistics. Look, I know this is controversial. It's controversial everywhere. But I do think we've learned a lot from the research and the data about what helps students succeed, and this right math course is a big deal, right? So you got to have conversations about them. As I said earlier, what do you take home? You're designing the student experience, so design it together. Figure out what the right math course is for most of your students. Maybe it varies by meta major. I work with colleges, I didn't suggest this, that they had 6 meta majors at this college in Asheville, and only one of them was college algebra, the right math. The other 5, it was quantitative reasoning or statistics. And by the way, if someone went into one of the other 5 and all of a sudden loved math and wanted to be in STEM, they created a bridge back to the algebra sequence for them, right? So these are ideas you get to discuss. There's not one right answer to this, but that's a big part of Pathways, is having that discussion. How do we help students get on a path? Again, I would say that you guys have some great things already underway here, career and transfer exploration. We got to talk to students earlier about these transfer pathways. Alamo down in Texas and San Antonio, they took their largest 70 programs and they mapped them to each of their 7 largest transfer destinations. So they knew what the difference was between someone wanting to transfer in psych to UT San Antonio or to Texas State or to UT Austin. And guess what they then tried to do? They tried to take the courses that were different and put them later. Why? Because if you don't know where you're going to transfer, try to have all the courses that transfer anywhere in the first year. So when you get closer to knowing, you're not less likely to have to repeat them. So this career and transfer information is a big deal, right? Your career coach is a great step on the career side. Academic and financial plan. So these maps you're going to do over here, that's awesome. The question is, what does that translate to for every student? So I was at a college recently that implemented program maps last fall. I asked the college a question, hey, how many of your students have a customized full program education plan based on their maps and history? I've started asking this question a lot now at colleges that rolled out pathways. One of my favorite answers to this, and the most common one, is I don't know, which I would argue is a problem. But at some colleges, even who have the maps, the answer is, I don't know, 10 or 15%, which begs the question, why did you go through all this? If we're not translating these default maps into customized plans for every student, right, that take into, hey, some of them have dual credit, some of them came from Madison, some of them came from other community colleges, some of them can only take 9 units, some of them failed a class last semester. What's my plan to finish in psychology, not the default plan? I like the default plan. It's a great place to start. What's my plan? How are we going to help students get that? Integrated and contextualized academic support. I think you guys use the term embedded support here. Is that what I've been hearing? How do we embed support where we know students are? The classroom, right? Great stuff underway already there. Keeping students on the path. How do we monitor progress on the plan? How do we know when a student's fallen off path? I mean, you have data, right? And even before you have complex analytical software, you have a great IR office who could run lists for you of students who were on plan and are now off plan. Maybe we should do something with those students. If you've got advisors and faculty advisors and coaches monitoring the progress, you've got a great step forward. I know a lot of that stuff's in place or under development here already. How about intrusive support? What do I mean by intrusive support? Well, maybe it's for your students who are pre-nursing. Maybe it's for those students who you see who've been here for 3 or 3.5 years, are pre-nursing, that pretty much don't have a chance of getting into your nursing program. Maybe we should catch them before they've been wandering around for 5 years, taking AP 4 times, right? Maybe after the first or second time, we could contact those students and say, hey, let's make sure nursing's the right major for you. You've taken a lot of courses here already. Maybe there's other majors that lead to a living wage that might fit your skill set better, right? If a student's been here 3 years, has a 2.2 GPA, right? I know you have some interesting things with your nursing program here that student actually can still get into nursing, but the likelihood is much less high. How do we intervene in customized ways? How do we give students frequent feedback? There's a college, this is, by the way, a really poorly named program in Florida, who has something they call the good and bad list that they run every semester. They never call it this to students, by the way. But this is a back office function. Someone like Tracy or Tracy's team runs a list every semester of students whose GPA went up by 0.3 or down by 0.3. They contact both of these groups with a customized argument. The ones who went up by 0.3, they say, hey, guess what? We saw you had an awesome semester last semester. Congratulations, nice work. Where does that ever happen, right? The kind of positive nudges we give students. And the ones who dropped by 0.3, they didn't contact them and put them on probation. They contact them and say, hey, we saw you had a rough semester. We're here to help. How can we help get you back on path? How can we get you back on your plan, right? If you have limited resources, why not target them to the ones you know are starting on a negative path before they get too far, right? That's a big guided pathways idea. Hell, scheduling. One always has to ask the question, who the schedule at a community college campus is actually for. Is it for the faculty or is it for the students? Now, in program areas, it's definitely, no surge tech program director has ever scheduled 4 classes at the same time that a student needed to take, right? You would never do that in a program. But for a lot of your gen ed students, and sometimes for your technical students trying to get gen ed degrees, there's a big question whether they can actually get the courses you even say they need to take. Are they offered on a schedule so that students can actually take them? By the way, if I do focus groups with your students, which we're going to do next time we're here, I guarantee you they're going to say, not always, right? So scheduling is an interesting question. Like, how do we schedule the courses students need to take when they take them versus the way, I don't know how I ever scheduled, I think in social sciences, my dean would come with a schedule from last fall. It would be this fall, getting ready for this fall. He'd say, hey, anyone want to change when they teach? That dean's job was to make his faculty happy. So if Chris says he wanted to teach at 10 and Kat said he wanted to teach at 8, they switched. We just switched them. Were we paying any attention to what that meant for a student's schedule? No. And that's how scheduling's worked in a lot of places. Maybe it doesn't work that way here. But the question of how do I make my faculty happy, or by the way, what course can I open that will fill, which is an enrollment management question, right? That may not be the question. What courses do students need to take to get to where they want to go, and when should I offer them? Right? That's a different way of thinking about enrollment management. So that's a big deal. Finally, on ensuring students are learning, what are the field-specific learning outcomes we want for our students? How do we make sure students have active learning out? How do they have field-relevant experiential learning? I heard some great stories on this today from things you guys are starting on this, embedding kind of community-based learning into classrooms. That's awesome. How do we help students develop relationships in their field and their community? That's a big guided pathways idea. So these are the big ideas of pathways. I want to stop now and let you guys ask questions. There's so much more to this. The going forward piece of this is you guys have signed on to work with us over the next couple of years. We are here as friends, critical friends, guides, catalysts. We are not doing this work for you. Sorry. You guys get to do the work. You guys do get to design what you think these ideal student experiences look like. We will share with you what people all over the country have done. We've worked on most of the major national and most of the state initiatives. I work with 25 colleges directly now in this kind of cohort. We'll come back roughly every 3 or 4 months to help you set up approaches that help you design the answers to these questions. You've got a great team in place. You've got some great playing pieces on the board. I'm much more excited about you today at 3:45 than I was at 8, where I already thought it would be pretty cool to work with you. But I've heard some great stuff today. I think you have some really great things to build on. But you also got a lot of hard work to do. You got a lot of hard questions ahead of you. And by the way, everyone who listens to this will find things about guided pathways that they are very happy to change in someone else's area. Right? I know what student services needs to do differently. I'm just going to teach the same way I always do. I know what those faculty need to do differently. I'm going to advise the same way I always do. It's much harder to think about this stuff collectively and together, have the hard conversations, and ask yourself, how do we have to collectively change the student experience? What's my role in that? It's not moving everything 180 degrees in the other direction or 90 degrees in the other direction, but it's putting on the table hard questions. What is the right math? When should students take it? What does it mean to have a customized full program education plan? When do we intervene in students' paths when we see they're not being successful? How do we put these transfer pathways in front of students? How do we focus on teaching and learning? They're hard questions. We'll call some of the questions. At the end of the day, you guys get to design your approaches to it. So, having said all that, any questions? Chris, any comments, any things I missed as you were listening?
No, I think let's turn it to questions.
Yeah, let's turn it to you guys. What are some questions you have, some concerns? One way to ask this is, what excites you about this? What scares the hell out of you about this? What makes this harder or easier here? Those are my favorite 3 questions. How about one positive response? Because I'm incredibly narcissistic. And I want to hear one positive response before you tell me the 8 million things you don't like about this. We got an amen from the back corner there. I don't know what that is. That is really exciting. That consistency is big to your students, right? Yeah, I give that an amen. Thank you. Yes?
I love the idea of having predictable schedules for students where they can block out time, plan their lives, and know 2 years from now I'm going to go Tuesday nights or Tuesday mornings.
I mean, I don't know what job you guys had at 19 or even at 35 when you came back to college, but every job I had at 19, if I went into my manager and said, I know I was able to be here Tuesday, Thursday from 2 to 6 this semester, but I have a class then next semester. Can you change my schedule? No. I'm not changing your schedule because I got 20 other people like you over there that can have to do the same job when I want them to, right? This is a big deal, this predictable scheduling thing. Students will tell you it's a big deal. It is, by the way, one of the reasons your students go from full-time to part-time and bounce back and forth is the schedule, right? You're not being able to get the courses they want when they need them. What are some other things? Now you can ask all the hard questions. We got 2 things that were positive, so perfect. Oh, come on, you have hard questions. What are you worried about? Yes, thank you. Perfect.
I'm in financial aid.
That's what she just whispered to me.
And I'm super excited to see financial plan. So I'm curious what you've seen, what that looks like. I've got some ideas, but
yeah. So my colleague Priya Chaplot, who's not here today, will be here next time, is my student financial stability expert. And so we helped write a paper for the Lumina Foundation a couple of years ago called Beyond Financial Aid. That wasn't because financial aid was bad, but because one of the things about financial aid, of course, is it is the place on a community college campus that has the fewest degrees of freedom, right? Because you're over-regulated by the state, you're over-regulated by the feds. finding innovative approaches to financial aid is hard. So the fact that you even have ideas about this makes you different than most financial aid offices, right? Because it's very much a compliance mentality in a lot of places. And so I think the questions around financial plans and financial stability is, how do we leverage public benefits? How do we leverage resources? How do we leverage some of the things you guys have, food pantries and the other things, in, again, predictable, consistent ways to serve students? How do we attach them? How do we get them to scholarships? How do we get them to Pell more than we do? How do we use loans only as a last resort? And the other thing about the financial plan is, how do we make sure they understand how long it's going to take and what they're going to get on the back end, right? And by the way, that transfer with junior standing after 2 years is a great financial answer, because it means you got 3 years left of financial aid, or 5 semesters or whatever it is to finish. And so I think we have some, especially my colleague will have some observations and suggestions about some good things you already do. What are one or two of your big ideas? Emergency loans, yep. Yeah. So what you can't hear, because she's way up here and you're all back there, is she was talking about your emergency funding program, by the way, which is a very great thing to have. Not all colleges have it. But the emergency funding, when you analyze, looking back at it, some of the things you find that you have to emergency fund for, if you had done things up front, you would have caught it before it became an emergency. Right? And that's kind of a more systemic approach to the things around the financial aid office. So I think there's some very cool things in there that we can hear what you guys are doing and maybe make some suggestions from other colleges as well. Other questions or observations? We've reached the, if we don't ask questions, he'll let us go stage. I know that stage. I stood in front of a lot of rooms. Yeah, tell me, man.
Hey, Shondell, I'm curious to know, like, when you talk about the working relationship, what does that actually look like in terms of you all helping us?
Oh, okay. What in terms of NCII supporting? So we come 6 times over 2 years, basically. It's a one-day visit, 5 of those 6 times. The only kind of requirement, the next time we come, we're going to talk to a lot of you. We're going to do 15 45-minute interviews in one day. By the way, you might ask how that's logistically possible. It's a fair question. We actually meet with cabinet. I bring 3 other friends on that one, colleagues. We meet with cabinet for 45 minutes. Then we meet with each one in 2 different rooms, 7 groups each. And we meet with varying functional groups. Technical faculty, kind of gen ed faculty, math and English faculty. We meet with student services frontline people. We meet with managers. We meet with deans. We meet with administrators. We meet with your community members. We do 2 student focus groups where we're really getting at the culture of the college. What are some themes we see? We're neutral, right? We don't know much about your college. We listen. We listen to the things that you're frustrated with. We listen to the things that you think are going really well. We kind of extract some learning from that and help inform the work that comes after it. The other big thing about what we do with colleges is we help you kind of formulate and kick off design teams. So you're going to have to identify the areas of the student experience you want to work on first. You can't do it all at once. It's overwhelming. So if you want to, maybe you're going to have a group that's working on program mapping. All right, well, that's a design team. You're going to have a team design your program mapping approach. We'll help kick that off. So as a neutral partner, we can say, some things like, be really clear about what that group's trying to solve, what's the timeline, how might you staff it. Those are all decisions you will make, but then we'll support that group when we come back the times after that. So visits 3, 4, 5, and 6 usually are meeting with the design teams. So we usually meet with the steering committee. Then we meet with individual design teams about what they're working on. And in the interim, you can ask us questions, and we'll bring in research from other colleges. And sometimes what we do is, let's say you guys have a specific need in, I'm going to make something up so it's not controversial. You have a specific need in community engagement. By the way, that's probably not a thing. But I didn't want you to think, you guys got a big problem. It actually is a thing. Right, okay, so we have that thing. We've got expertise on that. It's in my back pocket. No, I was trying not to pick something controversial, but apparently I managed to do that. We can bring national experts here to lead like a 3-hour session on that, kind of topically focused, scattered in with the kind of design team work. But one of the things we try to help with early on is helping you guys establish, if you're going to set up these design teams, what are your design principles for these teams? Like, what are the things that are going to guide their work? Here's an example. Can they propose things that require funding or not? I don't know. You guys tell me. Like, your leadership has to tell me. Can that group propose things that require funding? And if they're going to propose things that require funding, how does that look? Other design principles, like, can we actually, in our design team work, propose things that are mandatory for students? I mean, I would suggest the answer to that should be yes, but if that's not the college culture, then design teams need to know that ahead of time, before you set them off to working, they come back at the end of 6 or 9 months and go, here's your recommendation proposal. You say, well, no, we didn't want that. You can't do that. We help set that up first because it's operationalizing the work. And if there are specific areas that you have an interest in at the college, we'll bring some kind of expertise on that. You also get support from us between visits, where you can fire us questions about what's going on around the country. We sometimes meet with design teams over the phone between visits, so it's very much focused on supporting you on your journey. We are not in this for the long haul. We are not trying to be your consultant for the next 35 years. I'm a former consultant from industry. I hated being in organizations or working at companies where they just signed on with a consulting firm. They just kind of lived there for the next 7 years. That's not what we're looking to do. We know you're not going to be done with Guided Pathways in 2 years, by the way. There's a 0% chance of that. Guided Pathways is a journey, but we want to help you kind of kick that off and support you along the way, and then we'll go work with some other colleges and be here to support you in whatever way we can after that's kind of 2 years. So that's how it unfolds. Hoping to get to meet with many, if not most of you over that time, either on design teams or answering questions in kind of topical workshops. So, great question. Maybe one more. And if you have hard questions you don't want to verbalize out loud, you can always email me. I'm not hard to find. If they're really hard questions, you should email Chris. He knows all the answer to the really hard questions. Here's how it's easy to find me. You can also find a bunch of information on our website about Guided Pathways, how we view Guided Pathways. So other questions, observations. Yes, please.
So I know that there's a push to have an associate's degree at around 60 credits.
Yeah, nationally and in the state and locally,
Okay.
yes.
We have statewide curriculum that we share. We're looking at the benefits of having a common first term or first term experience. How have you seen that work out so that the students are taking credits that can be applied to a degree, and also so that the whole curriculum is not completely rewritten in order to pull out common pieces so that they have money more than 60 credits?
You want to answer this there, state guy? No. I tried to get you to answer this. It's a great question. So look, transfer policy in states varies. Like if you can imagine a model, it exists, right? And there are states like Florida who spent a lot of time 20 years ago, right, wrestling with the issue of what are going to be the courses that are accepted at all 2- and 4-year universities in the state. It's not perfect, right? But they have a common curriculum, a common course number, and common articulation. By the way, if you go back to my Aspen Prize hat for a second, it's also a place that has a disproportionate number of Aspen Prize finalists and winners. Why? Because they have great state policy, and then the colleges use it, right? You don't have great state policy. You're trying to build better policy. I think the idea of common first semesters is a great direction to go, because on that standpoint, you want to have at least that first semester be a place where people can start branching from. I think of Alamo when I think of this in Texas. Texas doesn't have great transfer policy either, right? Those 7 colleges that Alamo sends their students to in San Antonio and around Texas, they are not accepting the same courses, right? So there's work to be done. I guess the question is, are you talking about with other community colleges and 4-year schools in the state, or just primarily with your transfer partners? Or local? All of the above?
No, local within, in order to get their degree.
So
It's a 6-term program, a 5-term program.
Yeah.